Greetings and welcome to this United Nations Association of New Zealand webinar on the topic Women in Peacekeeping, a Key to Peace. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Nā o mai haere mai ki te rōpu whakakotahi whenua o Aotearoa. Ko Peter Nichols toko ingoa. And in Samoan Language Week, talofalaga. So welcome to everybody. The goal of the United Nations is to promote engagement with the United Nations. This webinar continues the pursuit of that goal. We warmly welcome new members to the association with our 6 branches nationwide. If you would like to join, then please visit our United Nations Association of New Zealand, UNANZ website. On the 29th of May, the United Nations pays tribute to all the men and women who have served either as military, police, or civilians and continue to serve in United Nations peacekeeping operations for their high level of professionalism, dedication, and courage, and to honour the memory of those who have lost their lives in the cause of peace. This year's theme, Women in Peacekeeping, a Key to Peace, was chosen to mark the 20th anniversary of the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. This is one of the 8 priority areas of the Action for Peacekeeping, or A4P, initiative, which the Secretary-General launched in 2018 to strengthen peacekeeping. This year, our peacekeepers are facing what the Secretary-General has described as the greatest challenge since the Second World War. A bold statement indeed. And of course, he's referring to the COVID-19 pandemic. Peacekeepers continue their operations despite that risk. New Zealand supports United Nations peacekeeping operations and regional peace support efforts in the Pacific and other parts of the world. New Zealand recently completed 3 substantial and sustained peace support missions in Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, and Solomon Islands. New Zealand has helped train Iraqi security forces also. The personnel remaining are deployed on 10 operations and UN missions across 11 countries, including Afghanistan, Sinai, South Korea, and South Sudan. I now invite our Special Officer, United Nations Security Council, Dr. Nagar Patel, to introduce our 4 distinguished speakers and to chair the evening. Nagar.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. This is a very special day for everyone who's joining us to listen to the amazing experiences of 4 amazing panelists who have experienced the life of working with women in different contexts, working with peacekeepers in different contexts, and I'm privileged to be the mediator of this evening, and I very much look forward to listen to all of you. Interestingly, just before we started this session, I was listening to some of our panelists discussing their experiences, and I could listen to them for many, many days. So I encourage all of you to engage with them and ask questions, and I will be very happy to pass your questions to our speakers. So without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Ms. Cecile Hellier. Ms. Cecile Hellier is the Divisional Manager of International Security and Disarmament Division in New Zealand, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Very welcome to our panel. Ms. Hellier leads the team which covers defense and national security policy coordination, transnational organized crime, emerging threats policies such as cybersecurity and space, disarmament and non-proliferation issues, as well as counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. Prior to taking up her current role in September 2019, Cecile was seconded to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet from 2016, first as the Director, Intelligence and Assessment, including responsibility for National Assessment Bureau, then as Acting Deputy Chief Executive of National Security Group. These responsibilities covered national intelligence assessments and intelligence coordination and national security policy, including cybersecurity, emergency management, and security and intelligence policy. This week, she has been promoted to Ambassador in Counterterrorism in Wellington, so very congratulations, Cecile, to promotion. And in her career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Cecile has been Director of Global Development for the New Zealand Aid Programme, leading teams engaging in bilateral development in regions outside the Pacific, and Ambassador to Mexico, other postings such as Moscow, London, and Noumea. So very welcome to our panel, and without further ado, I leave the floor to you. Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karanga maha. E hui hui mai nei tēnei rā, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto katoa. Thank you very much for the honour and the privilege of presenting on the United Nations International Day of Peacekeepers on Women and Peacekeeping, a Key to Peace. And I should say talofa loa to all our Samoan listeners. I hope there are some. Where diplomacy ends, war begins. It's often a nice idea to start a speech with a quote, and this one, maybe it's not usually a good idea to start a speech with a quote by Adolf Hitler, especially in talking about foreign policy, peace and security. And you could be pretty sure that foreign policy diplomacy was only a brief way station on the way to war for Hitler, something of a diversionary tactic. But it is an apt quotation. In advancing peace and security, you need to turn to a more illustrious source, Plato, the power to think and the will to act. Thinking and talking needs to be backed up by an ability to deter. So if you look at UN Security Council 1325 on women, peace and security, the resolution adopted in the year 2000 to ensure women's inclusion in peacekeeping needs to be part of decision-making and involvement in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. It's natural that the agencies involved in its implementation are MFAT, the New Zealand Defence Force and New Zealand Police. Resolution 1325 was a landmark human rights resolution. It formally acknowledges the changing nature of warfare in which civilians are increasingly targeted and women continue to be excluded from participation in peace processes. It specifically addresses how women and girls are differently affected by conflict and war, and recognizes the critical role that women can and already do play in peacekeeping and peace-building efforts. The resolution affirms that peace and security efforts are more sustainable when women are equal partners in the prevention of violent conflict, the delivery of relief and recovery efforts, and the forging of lasting peace. I will leave to my distinguished defence colleagues to speak about the leading New Zealand Defence Force role and engagement on women, peace and security. I would like to frame our panel discussion by setting out how this fits into our broader foreign policy and identity. New Zealand is a strong advocate for the rights of women and girls internationally, including in the area of women, peace and security. Gender equality and women's empowerment are priority areas in New Zealand's International Human Rights Action Plan. We're in the final stages of reporting on our implementation of our first National Action Plan, which started in 2015 and concludes in 2019, on UN Security Council resolutions relating to women, peace and security. And we will soon reiterate our National Action Plan to continue advancing the 4 pillars of women, peace and security: participation, prevention, protection, and relief and recovery. This approach has its roots in our particular views on security and the role that women can play. If you take the adage, geography is destiny, you might think New Zealand could have stood aside from the troubles of the wider world. Former New Zealand Prime Minister David Lange once said that New Zealand was a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. And I think he was trying to illustrate our strategic isolation. And yet we've contributed troops to foreign conflicts since 1899 in the Second Boer War. Our initial engagements were undertaken not out of a sense of global responsibility, but of being a British colony. Most famously, then PM Michael Savage summed up the national feeling in 1939 with the following comment regarding Britain: "Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand." It did take us some time to cut the umbilical cord. It was only in 1947 that New Zealand adopted the Statute of Westminster, passed in 1931, and moved out of British Dominion status. Around the same time, however, in the 1940s, we were a founding member of the United Nations and a very strong supporter of the principle of collective security. Then New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser is remembered for his principled opposition to the veto for the 5 UN Security Council permanent members, an opposition upheld by successive New Zealand governments to this day. Support for collective peace and security, buttressed by addressing economic and social issues, is a key feature of New Zealand's independent foreign policy. It has been given practical effect in a number of ways. We have contributed troops and personnel to UN peacekeeping operations since they began in 1948, to more than 40 peace operations in more than 25 countries over the past 7 decades, either under UN auspices or as part of coalitions. We've been part of some of the longest standing missions, such as the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO, working on peace building and peacekeeping in the Middle East since 1954, and to UN peace support on the Korean Peninsula also since the 1950s. We've contributed to some of the most difficult missions in the former Yugoslavia, Somalia, and Afghanistan, and in the last where we have a particular women, peace and security focus. We have made a special investment in peace and security in our region. In Timor-Leste, we provided over 6,000 military personnel, as well as hundreds of police and civilian personnel. Along with Australia, we were the key contributor to peacekeeping operations in Solomons through Ramsey, and in Bougainville, we were able to broker the 2001 peace agreement. Beyond contributing troops, we have supported global governance and policy mechanisms for international institutions, including the supreme global body for peace and security, the UN Security Council, on which we have served 4 times, most recently in 2015 and 2016. And noting that you cannot have peace without justice, we have supported the international rules-based order, including through Sir Kenneth Keith's 9-year tenure as a judge on the International Court of Justice. Putting ourselves forward for high office is something that we take seriously, something that we believe is our right to aspire to. New Zealand has never believed that might makes right. It is not in our interests, and it's not in the interests of any small state, nor indeed any state, despite the recent return to favour of nationalist tendencies and flirtation with great power politics. We live in a world more interlinked than ever before. Climate change is a salutary, dramatic reminder that we all share the same planet, and now, personifying the great leveller, we grapple with the coronavirus. In short, we have a happy alignment of our interests and values in promoting the rights and obligations of small states and contributing to collective security. Recognising the critical role of women in advancing peace and security fits well with our reputation for being a country focused on advancing the role of women, most notably for being the first country in the world to give women vote, but not only that. While Carol and Jennifer will speak to the focal areas for which New Zealand Defence Force has prime responsibility under UN Security Council Resolution 1325, I would like to touch on 2 where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade has the lead. First, on advocacy, supporting the need for women's participation in peace processes, conflict and humanitarian situations, and decision-making processes in various UN forums, such as the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. This includes supporting all gender-related resolutions at the Human Rights Council in 2019, such as extending the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And the second area is humanitarian support, providing humanitarian funding to support international agencies that work towards providing life-saving care and assistance to women and girls. In 2018 and 2019, New Zealand provided a total funding of 21.5 million New Zealand dollars to the International Red Cross and 6 million to the UN Population Fund. And since 2019, New Zealand has contributed $3 million in annual core funding to the UN Peacebuilding Fund, which funds a significant body of work supporting inclusion of women and peace processes. Lastly, I'd like to say a few things about the linkages between disarmament, women, peace and security. Disarmament remains a fundamental path for advancing peace and security and is intrinsically linked to New Zealand's identity. Nuclear disarmament is often described as being in our DNA. New Zealand did, after all, have the world's first nuclear-free legislation in 1987. But our disarmament engagement is much broader than that, and we continue to push for progress against all weapons of mass destruction, cluster munitions, landmines, small arms and light weapons, explosive weapons in populated areas, and all other forms of indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. Like many areas of global security work, disarmament fora have traditionally been male-dominated. There is, however, a rapidly growing recognition of the relationship between disarmament and women, peace and security, with a central focus on two key themes. First, the importance of equal, full and effective participation of women in all decision-making processes related to disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control. Second, the need for gendered impacts of weapons to be taken into account when considering all aspects of disarmament, from the prohibition and control of weapons through their destruction or clearance to the provision of appropriate victim assistance. In its 2019 study on gender balance in arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament diplomacy, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research noted that the proportion of women participating in such diplomacy has grown steadily over the past 4 decades, but that women nevertheless remain underrepresented. In 2018, for example, among all delegations to meetings of the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, the Conference on Disarmament, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee, only 34% of delegates were female. The statistics are even worse in leadership positions. While men made up 66% of the delegates to these meetings, 76% of the heads of delegation were men. Of course, there are exceptions. New Zealand has no shortage of women leading and working on these issues. Apologies. We are one of the few countries to have a female ambassador for disarmament, the formidable Del Higgy, who is also the current and first ever female chair of the Missile Technology Control Regime. At the same time, Nicole Roberton, our ambassador in Vienna, is leading New Zealand's engagement on nuclear non-proliferation, with Lyndall Walker in The Hague as our ambassador to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. In his 2018 Agenda for Disarmament, the Secretary-General expressed concern that the continued marginalisation of women in these discussions was a loss for all and called for the full and equal participation of women in all decision-making processes related to disarmament and international security. The Secretary-General has shown leadership on this issue, ensuring the appointment of women to the most senior disarmament roles within the United Nations, including Izumi Nakamitsu as the Under-Secretary-General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Renata Duan as Director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. But it is not simply a matter of getting more women in the room, on the podium, or behind the microphone. It is also a case of ensuring that we have the information needed to understand the gendered impacts of weapons on men, women, boys, and girls, so that this can inform our disarmament efforts. Recognition of these impacts has only recently entered into discussions in disarmament fora, and there is a long way to go before they are mainstreamed. That said, important work is being done in the negotiating chambers and out in the field, where, for example, women's insights are helping to ensure that mine clearance and victim assistance programs are delivering for whole communities. There has also been some success in high-level negotiations in recent years. Article 7.4 of the Arms Trade Treaty, for example, requires that states parties, when deciding whether to approve an arms export, shall take into account the risk that the items may be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or violence against women and children. The inclusion of gender-based violence in the Arms Trade Treaty is particularly important as it is the first time that an international and legally binding treaty has recognised the link between this violence and arms trade regulation. The latest international disarmament treaty, the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also features language on gender, noting the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation, and highlighting the need for victim assistance to be gender sensitive. Work in the field of disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control can make a real contribution to achieving the objectives we have set as part of our agenda on women, peace and security. New Zealand is committed to continuing its leadership on these issues, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade remains closely engaged with our partners and civil society to make this happen. In conclusion, New Zealand is a strong advocate for the rights of women and girls internationally, including in the area of women, peace and security. Gender equality and women's empowerment are priority areas in our action plan and in our national action plan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I now have the pleasure to pass over to my New Zealand Defence Force colleagues.
Thank you, Kia ora. Thank you very much, Sel, for a very interesting presentation. Now let's move to our next speaker and presenter, who has an extensive experience in peacekeeping, also engaging with women in the military context, and has quite an extensive experience in this field. Group Captain Abraham joined Royal New Zealand Air Force in 1989, graduated university in 1992, and then as an air crew navigator in 1994. She served on Royal New Zealand Air Force tactical transport aircraft as a UN military observer and as detachment commander for New Zealand Defence Force Air Transport Operation in the Middle East. Her command roles include command on the ground training wing, mission commander for VIP air transport task, and deputy chief of Air Force. Various staff roles have spanned to headquarter air command, so training, headquarter air staff, plans strategy, and headquarter joint forces command and operation. In 2015, Wing Commander Abraham, at the time, posted to Air Advisor Canberra. In 2017, she was promoted to Group Captain as Defence Advisor, New Zealand Defence Staff in Canberra. In 2018, she posted to Assistant Chief of Air Force Strategy Management. And in 2019, she was appointed Interim Deputy Chief of Air Force for a 10-month extended period in rank of Acting Air Commodore. In 2020, Group Captain Abraham returned to her role as ACAF Strategy Management. She is a graduate of New Zealand Defence Force Staff Course of the year 2004 and the US Air Force Air War College in 2015. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, a Master's of Strategic Science with honors, a Master's of Strategic Studies from Victoria University, and a Master of Strategic Studies in Grand Strategy in Air University of United States Air Force. We are very lucky to have you here, Group Captain, and I look forward to hear your vision on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Naga. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone, and thank you to the UN Association of New Zealand for the invitation to the New Zealand Defence Force to participate in this event today. I'd like to reflect just for a few minutes on why this is important to New Zealand Defence Force, and some themes and trends in the journey that I've observed over several decades. And then my colleague Jen Atkinson is going to outline in more detail the many ways in which the National Action Plan for 1325 is being supported and is in turn itself generating momentum in current and planned activities in peacekeeping in the New Zealand Defence Force. So really the why is pretty simple to me. In partnership with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as outlined by Cecile Hillier, and in police, and as in particular as well, the NZDF is a primary contributor of peacekeeping forces for New Zealand. And I think it's also important to note that really every New Zealand Defence Force mission has creating security at the core of its mission, and creating security creates the space for the peacemakers and the diplomats to be able to create lasting improved conditions in conflict areas. So it's interesting reflecting personally for me, reflecting on 20 years since UNSCR 1325 resolution was passed. Reminds me that 20 years ago, I was 1 month into a 12-month deployment as a UN observer with the UN Truce Supervision Organisation, UNTSO, in the Middle East. And so I was stationed in Damascus in Syria for the first 6 months, and working on observation posts on the Syrian side of the Golan in the area of separation for 5 days at a time in a 2-person team. I was the only woman UNMO in the Syrian station at that time, and I think there had only been one serve in that particular part of the mission prior. And so working on observation posts, working with local communities, but working with many nationalities amongst my colleagues, amongst my military colleagues. And some of them did not have women serving in the military at all. And so that was challenging and interesting for all of us, but also in the sense of just your presence can start to have an influence, and people finding connection and the ability to work together and moving past our assumptions. So the role was observe and report, but you also the role of an observer and a peacekeeper presence can be a diffusing positive influence just in and of itself. And I certainly did find that being the only woman in uniform in that area, that curiosity opens doors, and I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which curiosity can open minds and start conversations as well. So all of that also reminds me that the New Zealand Defence Force was actually leaning forward on including women in peacekeeping and in peacekeeping field work well before Resolution 1325 was signed. And so whilst, it took many years before we had a formal national action plan, that doesn't mean there was no action. And New Zealand Defence Force has also opened up all roles and trades in the New Zealand Defence Force for women. That's important, and it's important for the partners that we work with in this area, because to increase the proportion of women participating on mission, they need to be trained and ready and have the experience to be effective and successful. And so then fast forward 10 to 15 years and working in Joint Force headquarters, that experience allowed me to then challenge assumptions which still pop up about where it's suitable or where it's safe for women to be deployed. And so now places like missions in Afghanistan, missions in South Sudan, an amazing army colleague who's just returned from deployment from UN mission in South Sudan, are open to women, and they are making a positive difference. My challenge now, and as more women into senior leadership roles in the NZDF, our challenge is to influence the momentum and initiatives that will give life to the next National Action Plan. And And so this year, I'm NZDF's nominee this year to the Halifax Women in Peace with Women Fellowship. And that is a military initiative led by Canada that helps to develop a network of senior women, expose them to a range of government, industry, think tank, academia, foreign affairs, leaders, and give us the tools to have a greater influence and a greater voice when we have the opportunity at the table. So the journey I've observed over 30 years is a commitment to progress in New Zealand's approach to women in defence and in peacekeeping. We do acknowledge that there's always more to do and more to aspire to. We hope that many more women will see NZDF as a way to contribute to peace and security. And I'm pleased to say that Air Force reached a milestone of 20% serving in uniform at the start of this year. And I hope the Chief will forgive me for sharing that our next ambitious goal is 25 by 25. And so with that said, I'd like to hand over to Jen, who is really our expert in the Women, Peace and Security program of work within NZDF, to give you more of the detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kira. I think if you ever decide to write your biography, I will be the first one who read it. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and I look forward to our questions and answers time. So let's go to our next presenter. I'm very excited to hear your experience. We commanded Jennifer Atkinson from New Zealand Defence Force. She has recently been appointed to New Zealand Defence Force 1325 National Action Plan Implementation Officer for New Zealand Defence Force. She joined the Air Force as a psychologist in 2001 and held a number of positions across the organizations. Deployments include Solomon Islands and the Middle East, but her career highlights was her time as a Chief of Staff and Program Manager for Women, Peace and Security during the 4-month deployment for Pacific Partnership in 2015. Jennifer lives in Wellington with her family and enjoys trail running on the steep hilly tracks of Wellington. So welcome to our webinars, and we're looking forward to listen to you. Thank you, Jennifer.
Kia ora, Naga. Thank you very much, and thank you to the other speakers. Cecile, it was great for you to provide that context for New Zealand, and ma'am for also sharing your own experiences. So while I have recently come into the role, 6 weeks or so now, I would like to add that Women, Peace and Security, that agenda has been a big passion of mine for over 5 years now, and so this role I've wanted for a very long time, and I think that stems back to 2015 when I was really fortunate. I was briefly seconded to Equity and Diversity at the time, that's what it was called, Defence, and I had the opportunity to work on the first National Action Plan for 1325. And to be honest, I hadn't heard of it, and so it was a real eye-opener, and I loved what it was looking to achieve, and I do think we've got lots of places to still get to, but it was really invigorating. And then a deployment opportunity came up, and so it was in 2015 that I also deployed. So that was a really big year for me. And so while after that deployment I filled other roles, primarily in psychology or organizational development, I've still kept my interest in this area, and wherever possible, tried to continue my education and knowledge. So I will apologize now. I've got a presentation with a number of slides, probably too much information. So what I will do is I'll put the slides up and I will highlight the pieces, particularly of relevance. But what the slides will do is for people who see maybe a line of interest, you can use the question time to ask about any further information as well. So I'll just share screen, fingers crossed, everyone. Let's see, try that. Right, we're almost there, sorry. Here we go. Thank you. We can probably skip this first slide. So when I got asked to speak, you know, the topic was UN peacekeepers, female peacekeepers. And so anyone who reads the literature who's interested in this space will know there's a lot of value to having a female presence, and it's already been discussed by our earlier speakers. But the general themes you'll find is, you know, greater diversity, and that includes your decision making and better access. We talk about reflecting the communities we serve, and the implication being that when you have a diverse peacekeeping patrol or a group that's engaging, that's military, you can appear a lot less threatening when you mirror the community that you are serving. And the point is often made about creating role models. Female peacekeepers can serve as powerful role models for girls and women, and also for the other nations potentially serving in the military context. So this is what you read in the literature. You know, how does it pan out when you're actually deployed? Talking to my peers and also my own experiences, this is very true. You know, I can think of so many occasions where I feel there would have been opportunities missed if the gender perspective hadn't been put into planning, but also the presence of being a female that also created a lot more richer, diverse experiences. I remember as a couple of examples, we were planning engagements, and this was on Pacific Partnership. So we were going into ports, a number of ports in Fiji, Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, Vietnam. And the point of the engagements was obviously to connect with the community, all of the community. So there was a genuine desire there. And I remember hearing the planning and even things like the timing of engagements. You know, they were talking about a lot of engagements happening at 5 p.m. So when it worked for the ship staff to come off and engage with the communities. And they had done a few and they said, we're not getting the diverse, we're not getting the women attending. And, you know, the reality was is that 5 p.m. wasn't a good time for a lot of women who were taking care of their families. And also the choice of activities. It was really interesting for me to see what engagement activities had been planned, and on some occasions I came in at the end, so there wasn't a lot of opportunity for me to intervene, but a lot of the activities were, for example, we organised a community game and they organised basketball, and they wanted a female and a male basketball team to compete against a female and male basketball team from the ship. And they were able to get a male team from the community, but not a female team. And I remember making the comment that, you know, perhaps choosing a different sport, volleyball, which appears, you know, to be more gender neutral when you look at the number of people playing the different sports and things like that. So there were small things, but they would have also opened up, I think, opportunities to engage more. And because engagement was such a big part of Pacific Partnership, the idea was to approach lots of schools, community groups, orphanages, and we visited an orphanage, and it was a girls-only orphanage. And so the only way we were going to access that orphanage is if we had a group of female officers, NCOs, to go over to that orphanage. And so that was great. We had enough females and we were able to do that. So that was probably the one activity I did where it actually was all females, and it was really interesting, the experience, because every other engagement with young children, there was this routine where you would turn up, you would introduce yourself, and then you would go and play physical games and sports out in the field, and there would be music as well. And so we made a decision to do something different, and we got a whole lot of art supplies when we went to this orphanage. And we also, you know, put it over to the group of girls, you know, what are your interests? And in the end, they turned out to be, they had a dance troupe going on. And so one of the other young female officers had a sound system. So then they performed for the next hour. And I think it was just this idea of broadening what an engagement might look like. Because I did feed back to it that when we did go to schools and they did a lot of physical activities, there were times where the young girls weren't joining in, and talking to the teachers, they said it wouldn't be appropriate for the young girls to join in, to be physically close to males that they don't know. And so there was lots of little experiences like that across the time that made me sort of realize the value. And it was also very good to be able to go into the communities with my male peers and role model that really a respectful relationship as well between two serving military people. But I also missed the mark. I missed opportunities. I actually failed a few times in understanding the situation of the local woman and their circumstances and what it meant. And it was probably the best example was we had run a whole lot of workshops about community violence in Bougainville, and to thank the community leaders for their involvement and their support, we invited people to come back to the ship for a tour. So this was considered quite a big deal, and we arranged times that they needed to be at the dock, and we would get the boats to take them over to the ship. And I remember sort of waiting on the dock and explaining to all my contacts who were the woman representatives to be there at a certain time. And we're on the dock, and the woman hadn't turned up, and it was 10 minutes, now 20, and then it was about 45 minutes later. And I remember at the time feeling quite frustrated. And the men had turned up from the community group, so I couldn't understand why the women weren't there. And then the woman finally did turn up, and I think there might have been 9 people crammed into a single car. And I reflected back to seeing the 2 men arrive from their community in a van with just 2 of them. And so I had sort of missed the whole thing about that gender perspective of, all right, who has access to transport? How do people get around and things like that? And it was a real humbling moment for me. And I guess it draws on the second point of having females present has so much value, but equally it needs to go hand in hand with ensuring there's a gender perspective embedded in the planning and the conduct of operations. And I don't know if you could probably see the photo here on the slide. The gentleman there was an army captain in the US military. And he was a really powerful role model for me about applying a gendered lens. His role was CIMIC, and he was very, very knowledgeable about applying a gender perspective and very good at asking those questions. And I guess I bring this point out because the presence of women is important, but all of our military personnel, or anyone in any deployment setting or any context really, can apply a gender perspective and create a much more positive outcome for all the people in that situation. So at the end of the day, you know, I'm thinking, you know, if you look at our National Action Plan, what were some of the main drivers for the Defence Force? It was about increasing our numbers of women deploying and about gender mainstreaming and putting that gender perspective into operations and how we do our work. And so how is Defence going to achieve this? You know, to increase the female presence in our deployment, we actually also need to increase the females in Defence, and that is definitely a challenge. And what I've got up here is a couple of graphs, but really at the heart of it, it is actually a good news story. So New Zealand Defence Force has increased the number of females in uniform 3% over 5 years. So it takes a lot of work to increase our numbers, to attract people. And it's also about not just attracting, but retaining them. Because if you're attracting a lot of people, but you're losing them in the organisation, then it doesn't matter how many you attract, it's going to be problematic. And so it does vary across the three services. And it does sort of change over time, but still, you know, for our organisation, 3% is growth, and we are doing a lot more in this space now. We've got the Wahine Toa program, and that's looking to attract, recruit, develop, retain women. But because there needs to be a long-term investment in getting women into the Defence Force, we also have programs like School to Skies and School to Sea. So these programs are actually targeting young girls, 15, I think there might be 15 to 17, to do these programs where you get to basically spend a week, you know, with the Air Force and get exposure to the jobs and things like that, because we have to take these long-term approaches if we're trying to grow the number of females in the military. So how does it look for our deployment then if we're trying to grow just the overall numbers? The number of females deploying has increased. So in 2015 to 2016, we had 58 females deploy. Compare that to the next period I've described there, it's 96. So what does need to be made clear though is that our number of deployments and our size of our deployments increased as well. So when you actually look at our proportion, so what portion of those deployed are females, it's actually remained in the similar band, 13 to 17% over the last 5 years. So we aim for 15% of our women being female who deploy. And the latest data of March this year was 20%. So that's really positive. And it does fluctuate depending on mission size and mission number. And I imagine now with some of our missions sort of wrapping up that we will see a dip in overall numbers, but hopefully the percentage or portion will stay the same. So gender mainstreaming. So looking across NZDF, we've adopted the UN Women's Empowerment Principles. That was actually only earlier this year, which is really great to see CDF do that. We also have wider initiatives that fall under diversity and inclusion. And so we have Respect, which was to reduce harmful behaviours in our organisation, particularly towards women, and includes sexual harassment or harm. And just to make a more positive culture for everyone that serves in the NZDF. All members now of the Defence Force must undertake what we call SARE training, and that is, sorry, I just got to grab that on this. I just had a mind block. Respectful relationships. I'm just thinking, what is that first bit there? Oh. It's going to come to me. Sorry, I'll come back to that one. But we also have within the WPS piece, as per the National Action Plan, we emphasise in that plan that Defence would provide education on 1325 and embrace a gendered perspective in how we did operations. And so we've got a number of modules included and sort of lessons included across the board. So we've got lessons for those who are deploying, lessons for people who are just joining our organisation. We've got advanced WPS training for those at the more senior level of our organisation. For those that are doing planning courses, so we've embedded into the scenarios gendered perspective as well. And we also got and developed at the moment in development our first operational gender advisor course. So we're hoping to sort of get that off the ground at the end of the year or early next year. Unfortunately with COVID-19, it really has sort of slowed down some of the progress in that area in particular. And at the end of the day, because my role is actually positioned at Joint Force, a lot of work's being done to integrate women, peace and security into planning activities and operational readiness. We've developed a handbook, which actually it's a commander's handbook to guide them on how to implement WPS and explain what it is. I think the police, actually New Zealand Police, are going to create their own similar styled handbook very shortly. We've created cards, soldiers cards, that talk about conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, so that a patrolling soldier can refer to the card about how to respond if they come across that. So thinking about the real practical, tactical needs as well in our organisation. And we also have embedded gender perspective and gender inserts into our training scenarios when we have exercises. And so in 2017, I was the gender advisor on a sort of 2-month exercise that's held in New Zealand with a number of other nations. And to my knowledge, it was the first time that we embedded a gender advisor in New Zealand in an activity. So I feel like all these, they're progress and they're communicating the value across to the rest of the organisation. Sorry, this is a very busy slide. Again, I'm not going to talk to all of them. I guess what I'm trying to express with this slide is that there has been a number of initiatives and progress for Defence. We have trained gender advisors, not within New Zealand. We've sent them to overseas courses. NATO-led UN and Australia have both, they all have gender advisor courses. So we've put our personnel on those courses. So we went from 1 to 11. So we've got 11 trained gender advisors. And the beauty of that leads to the second point, which is when New Zealand just made the decision to support Resolute support mission in Afghanistan. So that was a decision to have a specific women, peace and security positions within Afghanistan. And we have sent 2 gender advisors who have since returned, and we've sent another 2. So their sole focus is about women, peace and security. And so that's quite a big win for us because we are a small nation, but I feel that there's a real opportunity for us to specialise and provide that gender advisor support. As you'll see for the next 2 lines, we've done some great stuff in the Pacific as well. We've launched the Pacific Defence Gender Network, and we had a Defence Force officer also go over and run a 5-day gender advisor course for Fiji very recently. And then we've also been involved with co-hosting the WPS Summit in Samoa. And that's been a really great opportunity where I think 24 nations attended that, 12 Pacific nations. And one of the outcomes was to work on the second NAP, the Regional Action Plan, in the Pacific. And as you'll see, there's been other conferences that we've been fortunate to be involved with, and often we've worked with MFAT to get these opportunities as well. And New Zealand Army has also set up a female engagement team as well. So I just sort of want to just briefly, I know I'm really conscious of time, just highlight a few of the challenges for Defence. The challenge of recruitment into the organisation, it is there, and we're doing our best in the space, but we really want to increase our numbers more. For me personally, when I have presented on women, peace and security, perhaps the biggest challenge has been the misunderstanding of what women, peace and security is. My audience is majority males, and I think before they come in the room, there's a lot of preconceptions about what women, peace and security is. And for some, I think there's a belief it's a woman's issue, or I've come to talk about sexual assault. And also there's this perception of add woman and stir. So that's an idea that, again, it's a woman's issue, and you put woman into the setting, then that's sufficient, rather than you also need to apply a gender perspective. And so a lot of people, perhaps there could be some pushback because they see the woman, peace and security as an additional task that they have to do when they're carrying out their mission or their task, rather than it's actually an enabler. And so, so often I think the conversation needs to happen to actually, discuss what maybe their assumptions are and grow their understanding about the value of women, peace and security. And also I think we have to be quite careful because if there is a preconception that having a woman present is really good, or this idea that it's because women are more empathetic, they can relate more, or things like that, we risk putting military women into one box rather than recognizing the empathy or the connectedness. Any military person can do that, just as our uniformed woman can also, you know, do the roles, the tactical roles, or the roles which perhaps have been male dominated as well. And always funding and resourcing, you know. I think I probably echo the thoughts of a lot of other nations. It needs to be resourced and it needs to be funded. You know, at the moment I am the sole NZDF person with Women, Peace and Security, although we recently actually have had a part-time person supported by MFAT, so a defence person working in the Pacific. But you know, it's a big organisation, and so getting more people to work in the space will obviously make my my journey easier as well. Apologies, I think I might have taken up a bit too much time, but hopefully that's got some material there if people have any questions as well. I will hand back over to Nagar. Thank you. Stop the share.
Thank you, Kira. Thank you. Our final speaker for tonight is Associate Professor Bethan Greener. Associate Professor Bethan Greener Bethan Greener is Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Massey University. She has published 3 books on international security topics, as well as numerous book chapters and articles on subjects such as international policing, police-military roles in peace and security operations, and the stability operation, the liberal peace-building agenda, and New Zealand's foreign and defense policy. Her current research focuses on gender and security, particularly on how countries are implementing the UN's Women, Peace and Security agenda. We are very lucky to have you, Dr. Greener. I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nagar. It's going to be difficult following on from Jen's talk. I thought that was fantastic. So I'm going to be covering a little bit of the same ground at times, but I actually think that's really valuable for reinforcing some of the key messages that we see in the broader academic literature and also the broader commentary about women peacekeepers, particularly in UN settings. So I'm going to go broad. I'm going to go back to the UN and provide you some facts and figures, and then talk about what I've perceived in New Zealand context. So from my perspective, I'm an academic, so I'm one of those people whose job and privilege is to sometimes poke and prod and ask difficult questions about how are we doing, what could we maybe do differently. So I'll end with some suggestions for thinking about where to in the future. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. Hopefully this is sharing for you. Actually, I'm going to stop it, and because it's brought it up on the wrong side. So hang on a second. Let's do this. It's still doing that. I'm going to pull this over to where I can see this. Okay. So do we have this live at the present time? Just checking. And wanting to move on the one. Okay, so you can't currently see my additional screen, is that correct? So you'll be seeing the screen ahead, fantastic. Okay, so moving along, just thinking basically about what the UN is trying to achieve, because that sets the context in part for what New Zealand has been asked to achieve as a country that signed up to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So as Cecile mentioned, this journey didn't begin perhaps, but was at least in part motivated by the UNSCR resolution 1325, of which we're in the 20th anniversary year of. And there's been 10 other resolutions since. And these have basically called for there to be a focus on what they call 4 pillars, looking at the prevention of violence, particularly gender-based violence, the protection particularly of women and girls, and also of their rights, and also the increased participation of women and girls in particularly roles of authority, but also in peacemaking and peace-building processes, and also encouraging the engagement of women and girls in relief and recovery processes post-conflict as well. And I think one of the key resolutions for thinking about when we're talking about women peacekeepers in particular is UNSCR 2242, which was very ambitious, called for a doubling of women in UN missions by 2020. But there was an admittance by in last year that they had fairly fairly slow responses to this. And obviously that's in part because the UN as a body is dependent on the member states' will and capacity to contribute in their troop and police contributing capacity. So as of the end of last year, women are only 6% of uniformed personnel. Now that's a little bit misleading because more women are on peace operations, but they may be as civilians or in the justice or sector, corrections, those sorts of things as well. But one of the things I thought was quite interesting too is to bring to the fore some of the other institutions. So we've mentioned police, and this is somewhere where the UN's doing relatively well. Last year they had 28.9% of all UN individual police officers deployed. That's normally the 10,000 in terms of the numbers of personnel deployed. Were female. Also 10.8% of formed police unit police officers were female as well. So a formed police unit, an FPU, is essentially a public order management or a riot control type of police. What's interesting though is the numbers do decrease when it comes to military contingents. Now I have that as 4.7% of all UN personnel serving in military contingents being female. The number does rise when you separate out particularly military observers and staff officers, and that's where the UN's doing quite well. That's up to about 16% overall. But the key aim for the UN that's been in a number of documents is that they want to get the number of women in military contingents from around that 5% to about 15%, FPUs up to 20%, UN police, individual police officers to 30%. And obviously they need their member states to deliver those personnel in order to be able to meet those obligations. And this is in part what the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is trying to stimulate. A call that went out in 2004 for member states to create national action plans. The purpose was in part to at least be able to see if they could get member states to increase their contributions. So national action plans are supposed to be commitments from member states as to how they seek to implement the ideals of Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So in thinking about New Zealand's National Action Plan, the one which we've just had, which Cecile has mentioned is coming up for a kind of review, and then this year there'll be a release shortly, I'm told, from MFAT of the first draft National Action Plan for the second iteration of their National Action Plan, the revised version. New Zealand National Action Plan responds to those 4 pillars of prevention, participation, protection, and we added peace building to relief and recovery. But probably one of the most vital elements of that is a commitment to increasing the number of New Zealand women deployed. And that was brought out really well in Jen's presentation, that there has been improvement on that front. But one of the things which I would like to kind of mention and reiterate is it's very difficult to do as well. So increasing the number of New Zealand women deployed in police and military roles was one of the 2 key stated objectives of the first National Action Plan. The second was the more diplomatic support for gender-based initiatives in the UN setting, which Cecile spoke to. And that kind of brings in those broad like disarmament or women's roles in development, as well as women's political participation more generally. So I think, why women peacekeepers? Why do we want those? Jen spoke to some of these issues already. And so in reviewing the literature, it's quite clear that people believe that having women deployed provides, again, that difference, that point of difference for the local population to engage with. And that engagement might be ready. Shouldn't particularly feel traumatized or vulnerable. They may respond quite differently to seeing a female peacekeeper in particular. So there's an increased chance, you've increased your chances of reaching more people by the idea being that you want to build trust, but also from a kind of more operational effectiveness concern, you may also increase your intelligence gathering capacity, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of arguments which revolve around increasing operational effectiveness. The chances of mission success are increased by the deployment of women. There's also, interestingly, some research which has been done which suggests if you deploy women alongside men in UN peace operations, there are decreased rates of those peacekeepers potentially perpetuating crimes themselves. in particular in and around concerns that have been voiced about peacekeepers committing sexual exploitation and abuse, that those acts, or the likelihood of those acts occurring, are diminished with the presence of female peacekeepers. The other emphasis, which I think is really positive, and there is quite a lot of evidence around this, and I think underscores the absolute vital importance of deploying women abroad, deploying women in missions, is that there is a lot of evidence to support the idea that role modeling is successful. And in the policing research, the picture up the top there is of a all-female Indian-formed police unit arriving into Liberia in 2007. And within about 3 years, the number of women in the Liberian police force had tripled, because they could see that these women were sites of authority, they were taken seriously, they were competent, they were able to work alongside their male compatriots, and basically boosted the confidence of local women to engage in their own security sectors. So this idea that deploying women peacekeepers can increase gender equality within host society is a very strong argument, and has got quite a lot of empirical evidence to support that claim. The other one, which I thought was really interesting too, is not only might it increase gender equality because, you know, a deployed mission demonstrates what women can do to the local host population, but it has often also impacted those deploying. So down on the bottom right, there is a poster for a fascinating documentary called A Journey of 1,000 Miles, which follows a Bangladesh police unit into Haiti. Basically follows a couple of women in their own experiences in that deployment. And one of the most striking features was that a number of these women within Bangladesh, they were very severely circumscribed in terms of what their police role was. They didn't typically handle long arms. They weren't tactically kind of deployed. They were usually used in administrative roles or to violence incidents only. When they got to Haiti, their expectations increased. They were given training on the ground. They were deploying into squatter settlements. They were dispersing riots, investigating crimes. And so when they then returned to their own country, their expectations increased as to what they were capable of and what they should be able to do. And so began to kind of increase the sense of gender equality back home in their own police force as well. So I think there's some fascinating and really interesting to support the idea of increasing women peacekeepers. But because I'm an academic, we also then kind of ask difficult questions about those sorts of phenomena as well. And it brings to mind something that Jen was saying. There's a lot of assumptions, particularly essentialized assumptions built in about deploying women peacekeepers. So the concern that you might see, the reason why you might deploy women is you think they're going to be more empathetic. They're going to be better at responding to conflict-related sexual violence or gender-based violence, or they might be better with children. There's a whole lot of assumptions that can be built in, and that's not necessarily the case. Just as, you know, men may not necessarily be aggressive, hypermasculine, and keen to do tactical types of operations. So there's that concern to kind of identify the fact that this is a skill set. Often deploying a gender perspective can be done just as well by a male US captain in the army, as Jen was suggesting. The other interesting thing is that some of the research has also shown that some women don't want to respond to other women. Often in if their own society see men as having sites of authority, they may prefer to respond to men, and this has also been borne out in responding to gender-based violence or domestic violence at times. It's been really good to have choice of whether or not a man or a woman is available to speak to, because sometimes there may not be the choice to necessarily talk to a female peacekeeper at that point in time. The other thing which I think is really important is that, yes, deploying women alongside men may help behaviour, discipline, and in fact, particularly discipline has been shown to have been improved. But it places a burden which shouldn't have to be borne full stop. And I think this is one of the key things that Jen alluded to as well, is that the importance of understanding the role that gender plays within society is not a burden to be borne by women alone. Men too have gender. And I think this is something which, if we focus, solely on the idea of increasing women, adding women and stirring, it can be easy to kind of think that we've solved a problem simply by putting women into a position, when there's often other things to bear in mind. And this happened in that case of Liberia. So that all-female Indian FPU ended up doing double shifts, because it was expected of them, not only would they do their policing jobs during the day, but at nighttime they would also be engaging in a whole lot of community service alongside with women's groups, but also helping to, I guess, kind of keep a watchful eye on some of their colleagues. So there was that question about the way in which women were having to perform at very, very high levels. And the other case that was mentioned with regards to role modelling being important, that it is really significant that some of the deployed police gained new confidence, gained new skill sets, but a number turned and were unable to then exercise those, which was unfortunate. And so a couple of cases of increased violence against them for wanting to perform roles outside what society expected of them. So I guess the whole point is that adding women is really important. I certainly don't want to detract from that. It's a brilliant and fantastic operational, so that instrumentally it's really important. It does increase operational effectiveness, but also, it's not just instrumental, intrinsically important, inherently important. It is also a case of rights as well, that we should have women being able to perform these roles at any point in time. But there's also that question about gender equality. And this, I think, comes back then to Cecile's talk at the beginning, where she was bringing to bear the idea that peace and security is relevant to a whole array of diplomatic fields, including disarmament. And so I thought I'd just underscore why gender equality, particularly for peace missions, for UN peacekeeping missions. Statistically, gender equality is actually really important for international peace and security purposes. It's been seen to be necessary for peace and security, for economic development. Particularly the Kumaraswamy study from 2015 was talking about how it's statistically significant for interstate conflict, which is quite a big deal in the international relations field. We focus a lot on democracy being an important indicator of peace, but gender equality is also an important indicator. The presence of women in peace processes increases the chances that peace agreements will hold, make it 30% more likely that peace will hold at least 15 years. So Cecile was also talking about support for making women's participation being really, really important. And this is a field, peace making and peace building is certainly a field where there's a significant statistical impact. But I also think one of the things is also it brings gender into the frame. It says that gender is important for thinking about matters of peace and security. And about also, I guess the point is also maybe take the focus also from just thinking about women and thinking also about how femininity or masculinity constrain or enable people within host societies, within our own society as well. That's something which is brought out in thinking about applying a gender perspective. What are the expectations of people because they are associated with being male or female, men or women, that present problems or opportunities for them as they move forward. So I think the other thing to note is this is again the that New Zealand does do really well in this space, undoubtedly, but we have a new national action plan coming out very soon. And some other national action plans, like the Canadian National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, recognises that domestic violence is kind of, if you yourself have an issue at home, then it also needs to be addressed part of the broader agenda. There also needs to be resourcing. Jen alluded to that. So Jen might be one person plus a half. So there is a similar situation within the New Zealand Police as well. For a long time, there has, I don't know if it's changed in the last few months, but there's typically been one person who wears this women, peace and security hat alongside many other hats. It's difficult to balance this on the shoulders of a few, and kind of broadening this out through increased resourcing would be, really helpful. There is more of a need to engage with civil society because NGOs often operate in this space. The next slide I'm going to bring up is from a meeting that a group of civil society actors had in April, where they discussed the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and New Zealand's National Action Plan, and put together a list of some of the things that to see being advocated alongside and in support of this idea of women and in peace roles, how to help facilitate that. The other thing is New Zealand could make this more visible in key documentation. So there was a promise in the first National Action Plan that this would appear in strategic documents, but it's not mentioned in, for example, in the 2018 Strategic Defence Policy Statement. It's not particularly present in a number of other documents as well. And having that visibility, again, underscores why it's relevant and important. Also, there are still some issues. I mean, it's, we'd love to wave a wand and increase the numbers. And I think Schools to Skies and School to Seas have been incredibly effective programs for demonstrating to young women that this is a career option for them and that they may want to pursue them. Army has currently struggling a little more, but I do know that the senior leadership and beyond within Army are incredibly committed to trying to increase rates of women in the Army, particularly in non-traditional roles, so in combat corps and elsewhere. And that also then leads us to the question of, though, to get women in, you often need to make them feel comfortable in order to feel like they're valued within an organisation. And I think a lot of that's happening at the moment and is changing so that the institutions themselves welcome women in. They're able to be retained, not just recruited, and then they're able to be deployed. So there's kind of a whole lot of change occurring within the institution, with the Wahine Toa program or with some of the other institutional capacities that are being brought in. There should be some positive changes in that direction. So I'm going to leave you with a list of, so we've got New Zealand's new National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, which this whole kind of why we want to generate female peacekeepers, the kind of those two things are significantly interconnected. The new National Action Plan is due out very soon. And I thought I'd put up here some of the points of view we solicited from a group of civil society actors. So it's a group of non-governmental organisations. Foreign Affairs, I believe that these kind of recommendations or these priorities are going to be kind of part and part submission towards the National Action Plan. But they're basically saying we need to prioritise this in terms of fixed budgets. Civil society would like to be involved more. Often, so for example, Southern Karapo 2017 that Jen mentioned, there were NGO actors involved. NGOs are often on the ground in conflict spaces or in peace operations spaces. So kind of building those relationships and prioritising WPS with civil society could be a way of strengthening capacity. Also a desire to see a really broad remit for thinking about what needs a gender perspective and the fact that these should be integrated into all programs. Also focusing on things like, again, owning any gender-based violence issues at home, focusing on conflict prevention and education, thinking about particular people, so intersectionality issues, who is impacted most by gender concerns, also monitoring and evaluation, and centering women's empowerment being really key to this whole thing. And that comes all the way back to Cecile's discussion at the beginning, where I think this has been a really strong thread of that in New Zealand foreign policy. And I think continuing that on, I think as Cecile was saying, this is and Jen was, and Carol were also saying, I think this is a space where New Zealand can make a really significant contribution on the global stage. It's something which, gender equality is seriously at home and abroad, and can definitely be something which is promoted with increased vigour with the new National Action Plan. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Kara, thank you very much, Beth. It was very interesting. Thank you. Now, before we get to the question and answer section, I would like to ask Peter if he would like to add some comments. Peter has been involved for a very long time with peacekeeping operations in the UN and from New Zealand perspectives and has been involved in many of the operations following the 1325 and before the 1325, is aware of those. So I wanted to know if you would like to give us some comments about your experience through peacekeeping.
Look, I would totally endorse the comments that Jen and Beth have made, particularly in relation to the impact that females have in peacekeeping. And I'll just leave you with one snapshot image that is indelibly imprinted on my mind. And the example was a small patrol of 12 New Zealand soldiers that included a female soldier, 2 interpreters, 4 vehicles that went into a small village in Afghanistan. Afghan society is clearly divided. Females are literally invisible. They're either not present on the streets or they're completely covered. Sitting on the side of the road was a group of men squatting down, and they looked at the New Zealand soldiers. And I could see this profound look on the faces of one of them who was staring intensely at the female soldier, and he was quite dumbfounded. He couldn't understand or process in his brain that this soldier was female, but looked, acted, and behaved in exactly the same way as all the other soldiers. And he nudged the guy next to him, and you could tell that they were having this conversation, trying to process what they were seeing. And the impact that that had on them was clearly profound. Similarly, the impact that female soldiers had in going to girls' schools in Afghanistan and talking about their life and their culture, particularly in those remote communities, also had a profound impact. So there's my snapshot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter. Now let's have a question and answer. We have a question, and I would like, if we can, all the panelists would comment on it. And if that's okay, we would kind of go with the order of presenters. Cecile, if you don't mind to answer the question first. So the question says, has the adoption of the responsibility to protect doctrine by the United Nations had any significant impact on UN peacekeeping mission in general, and in the role that women play in the UN peacekeeping missions in particular? So that's the question. Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I was in London when we were on the Security Council in the 1990s and covering reporting for New Zealand on some of the very significant conflicts at that time, which were posing strong concerns for the United Nations Security Council on which we sat, including former Yugoslavia, Somalia, Rwanda, and strong concerns about the protection of civilian populations and about the safety of UN peacekeepers. And it's been a very strong debate in the UN context ever since, and it's been a subject of very, very strong interest. It is vital, I would say, to the protection of civilian populations by peacekeepers, but it's not something that has been without controversy, including as regards questions about for sovereignty of the countries where the peacekeeping is taking place. It's the intersection, the nexus of human rights of particular individuals and populations, and of the rights of governments. And bearing in mind that peacekeeping operations by and large take place in a context whereby the United Nations is invited or asked to provide peacekeepers in order to keep the peace, but sadly all too often the peace is imperfect, and peacekeepers are operating in very difficult and conflicted environments where it can be difficult to protect themselves, let alone to protect the civilian populations. So I think it has certainly made a difference, and I would not say we have reached the point where we've been successful as United Nations member states in the way in which we engage in peacekeeping and responsibility to protect, or in coalitions of the willing, and all certainly as a general principle. I think it certainly has relevance for for women, peace and security. Women are very vulnerable in fragile states and post-conflict states or in conflicts, and so the responsibility to protect has particular relevance, I would argue, for women and girls. But it's certainly it's a work in progress. We have not we have a long way to go, I would say.
Thank you very much. Carol, would you like to comment on the question?
Yes, Nagath, briefly, I would endorse that it's certainly a complex to implement practically. And so it starts with the mandate that a mission has. So a UN mission, that derives from the Security Council. And so there's an element there that sheets right back to the intent and the mandate of the mission, in the sense of what then peacekeepers on the ground are empowered and permitted to do, and that's by consent of host nations is an important element of that. Absolutely, the balance between force protection of deployed forces and their resources and ability to protect the local population, but every peacekeeper feels just a human moral obligation to do what you can, and so it goes to mission design, but then also some of those practical realities on the ground, including some of those risks around perceptions of partiality amongst the parties in a conflict zone. And Beth might have more to say on that.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to comment on the question?
I'd probably only add that it's not clear how it actually plays out. And even when I put my psychologist hat on, we talk about moral injury. And that sort of plays out where this idea of wanting to do something, but perhaps not knowing if you have the mandate to do that. And I think it plays out sometimes between, what you can do and what you'd like to do. And sometimes it's not even always clear in those moments. So yeah, I sort of, support both the previous comments. But I always think there's often a tension that goes along for the individual peacekeeper as well.
Certainly. Beth, should I leave the grant to you? Would you like to comment on the question?
Sure. So from my point of view, I do think there's a connection between R2P and obviously the protection of civilians doctrine that we've seen increasingly used in mandates. And I think the emphasis on protection of civilians helps to reinforce the WPS agenda. So I think it has encouraged a kind of synchronicity with thinking about how multifaceted peace operations are and the different security needs of different members of the population. So for example, in Sudan, there had been some real with women in IDP camps feeling safe within the IDP camp, fairly safe anyway, but were leaving the IDP camps to go to market or to fetch water or other things that they wanted from outside the camp, and they were facing harassment as soon as they stepped outside the gates. And once this was brought to the attention of the police commander, he rotated police patrols on and off at regular times to help basically ensure that his mandate, which was protect civilians, was not just protecting them from death or significant physical harm, but was enabling them to live a fairly normal life. So there was a broader interpretation, I think, of the responsibilities under the mandate that they had. So yeah, I think there has been I think there is a kind of symbiosis or a kind of virtuous cycle with regards to the connectedness between the overarching R2P, then out of that falling an emphasis on protection of civilians, and that protection of civilians doctrine also obviously creating missions which are increasingly robust and the capacity after the capstone doctrine of 2008, the capacity of peacekeeping operations to protect the mandate rather than just act in self-defense. So yes, I think there's definitely been an increase in thinking about the multifaceted nature of peace operations. The idea that security is not just preventing someone either, that it goes beyond that. I think those things are all interconnected. Yep.
Absolutely, thank you. Peter, would you like to comment on the question as well? You're on mute.
Sorry, I'll let it lie where it lands.
Okay, so thank you very much. I do have a question to all of you, and I would love to hear your response to it. So you, as a woman, have worked quite extensively for many years in this area. We have been talking about your professional experience in the environment. How did you interact and your engagement with 1325? But my question is to you, as how do you perceive your challenges that you faced as a woman working in these often very male-orientated environment, even academia. So I kind of wonder if you can explain some of your experience to see, since we have passed this 1325 in 2000, we are 20 years into passing the resolution. It is supposed to have quite a lot of extensive impact on our environment as well as our personal experience as women. So I wondered if you would like to comment on your personal experience and you see, do you think we have progressed? I know you have talked about the space to progress, but I wanted to know, how would you see the challenges? Do you have similar challenges, or are the challenges less? So can we go with Cecile and start your views on it, if you would like to comment on the question.
Thanks, Nika. I mean, yes, if I think back to my mother when she graduated from university, and that was no small feat for her, being female, and the background that she came from, which was a fairly a low socioeconomic one. She had a choice of being a secretary, a teacher, or a nurse. Choices today are just so much greater, and I'm often in rooms where I am in a minority as a woman, sometimes the only woman. Some of the subjects that I deal with are male-dominated, including terrorism, cyber, those sorts of areas. But I think, as has been said about the mirroring effect, having people come before you and show the way is very helpful. I am not the first female ambassador for counterterrorism, and that is a very good thing. I was also thinking about Peter's comments about Afghanistan, and when I went there myself in 2011, I was responsible for a team that managed our aid program there. I was the only woman in the group that was visiting a hospital, and we were being shown around by one of the staff, and at a particular point she took me aside, and men were due to come with me, and she put her hand up to indicate that they should absolutely not do that, and we went behind a curtain, and it was extremely quiet just outside this curtain. We went in, and there were two very young women, must be just teenagers, giving birth with a sort of a bucket at the end of the bed. And I thought, had I been a man, I could not have seen that. I wouldn't have understood what these women were going through. And thinking about the program that we put in place in Afghanistan, we put provision for tractors for the men to grow potatoes, but we also put in a program for beekeeping, which was managed by women, and having an understanding of the different roles and the different ways in which we could empower them economically was hugely important. And I think sometimes, as has been said by Beth and by Jen and by Carol, you know, you get in the room, getting in the room sometimes is hard because you're a woman, but sometimes in particular societies and places, you can only get in if you're a woman, and that then gives you a particular insight and a particular responsibility to do something about that. And I find that a huge privilege and opportunity.
Thank you. Carol, would you like to comment on that, on the question?
It's an interesting one. There are still challenges, but increasingly less so in my personal experience. Certainly very on in I've spent a lot of time being the only woman on course. When I first joined the Air Force for the first few weeks, I was the only woman in my initial officer intake. And you know, that said, I've worked with some amazing men too, and but it can be hard to be the only, and then as you progress, it can be hard to find a voice, and for that voice to have influence when you are an only or a very few. But increasingly, and you know, in the past 2 years, I've spent a lot of time in at fairly high levels of governance forums with the New Zealand Defence Force, and I can personally attest to the fact that is becoming much less of a challenge in our environment. Increasingly, I feel respected, and people by peers, by our senior leaders. Some of the things we're doing for both our young women, but to encourage the pull through women who want to continue with a career in the military is peer support. So that's a big piece of Wahine, or one thread of what Wahine Toa is doing. We're trying some new initiatives at the moment. In the Air Force, we've had a very successful mentoring scheme, which is across men and women right throughout the organisation. Those sorts of active programs, and making it okay to talk about our challenges makes a big difference. So things are definitely getting better.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Jennifer, would you like to comment on your experience?
Oh, really just reaffirming what Carol said, you know. I think I've actually been really fortunate because of my trade group, psychologists, mostly females. And so I've been really conscious that my experience is not my peers' experience. And I'm really glad that I understood that very early on. And for example, having a peer in the engineering trade, you know, quite often, you know, there was one or two of them. And so, but in saying that, I have to say, you know, even if you are the majority in your trade group, when you go to a big conference or a big room, you will always find yourself outnumbered. And, you know, there can almost be this extra weight that you carry. And I think I had a bit of a moment where I came up with this line, and I truly got to a point where I believed it, which was, the difference that I am is the difference that I make, you know. And rather than seeing my difference being, you know, sort of an obstacle, I was like, no, you know, lucky me, you know, I'm the only one probably with this perspective. And so that really made me feel like a valuable asset, actually, you know. So I think that was and you know, you get older, and you know, I think that helps too, you know, you've had a bit more experience and things like that. Yeah, so you know, I think about how much flexibility the Defence Force has given me, you know, for someone at my rank to have been going part-time on and off for the last 10 years, you know, basically as the needs arose for me and my children, you know, I don't know if I could have found a more flexible employer. And so sometimes I think there's a preconception that defence, you know, is very rigid and very structured. No, we're very clear about what we want people to achieve, and we have lots of rules. But the way that they've allowed me to hop in and hop out of my career has been really fantastic. Yeah, I feel very fortunate, and I guess I really just want that for everyone, you know, male and females too. Yeah. So yeah, that's probably my 2 cents.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer. Beth, would you like to comment on that?
Just briefly, obviously I'm in academia, which is generally thought to be much more kind of well represented in terms of women in particular places, but both Nagar, yourself, and I operate in the field of international security, which does tend to be male dominated. And it can be difficult to want to express a point of view. I have often found, and I've been in some situations where I've wanted to raise gender, but I'm the woman and I don't want to be the one woman raising gender, when I think it's in fact valuable for everybody to think about as a factor, as a vector, as a part of the dynamic. So yeah, that can be quite difficult. So yeah, I was the one in the 2018 defence paper talks raising gender. Why is it not in there? You know, and then you get people nodding, but you know, I'm waiting often for somebody else to raise it. And I think it is indicative. So from a teaching point of view, talking about this stuff has gotten a lot easier. There's a lot less defensiveness about what might this mean for me. And I think also the next generation particularly has a very different understanding of the concept. For example, they actually know what the word gender means, rather than thinking it's biological. They understand the social constructed nature of the phenomenon. So it's a great starting point, although it meant I had to kind of, you know, throw out all my old lecture slides, which kind of assumed no knowledge. But I think probably most telling is, you know, you mentioned at the beginning with my bio that my research originally was very much on peace operations generically. Gender was not something I looked at, and that was almost purposeful, because I was highly aware if I was a female academic and I wrote on gender to begin with, that would be what I would be known for. That would be very difficult for me to potentially break out of. So finally, I'm now old enough and, you know, wrinkled enough to go, okay, let's go and have a look at this phenomenon, which has been around and I thought has been interesting. But in order to be taken seriously, I felt I needed to establish some reputation with more generic topics before I could kind of move into this field and be heard. So that's kind of an interesting personal reflection, I guess.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much age can help. Thank you very much, our amazing panelists. What an engaging and uplifting evening it was. Thank you very much. I know you all are very busy women dealing with a lot of important issues, so I very much appreciate, on behalf of me as the moderator and the United Nations Association in New Zealand, and on behalf of our audience, for taking time to be with us. I'm thankful to our audience to take our time. I know our conversation could continue for another couple of hours, quite happily. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for United Nations Association in New Zealand to organize this seminar. And I also want to thank Wendy Hart, who told me today in the morning that she's going to be lurking in the background, but without her, this webinar would not be possible. Thank you, Wendy, for all the amazing work and for connecting with us. I believe that this evening told us about all the progress, the path that we have continued, the challenges, told us that our goals are still way away, and we're going to reach into that in a distance time, and it's going to take a lot of perseverance, but we celebrate our steps, every steps and the milestones we take. I wish you all the best for your future and for your work, and thank you very much for joining us. I leave you to Peter for the final remark. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Nagar. Look, I think we've been privileged to hear the thoughts of 4 leading commentators and practitioners on a significant and remaining challenge that the world is facing. Thanks, Nagar, for chairing the meeting, Cecile Hillier for providing a high-level strategic perspective, Group Captain Carol Abraham and Wing Commander Jennifer Atkinson for providing practical perspectives and the realities of peacekeeping, and Associate Professor Bethan Greener for concluding with some thought-provoking questions. The video of this webinar and resources, such as the panelist presentations, will be uploaded to the UNAN's website, and you will receive an alert when this happens. We encourage you to share with your networks to keep this conversation alive. Thank you for your attendance and support. I also thank Wendy Hart for bringing this webinar to you. I normally conclude with a blessing, a proverb, or a whakatauki. In this context, I can think of nothing more profound than, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." The word peacemakers does not imply pacifism, unlike other sections of the Sermon on the Mount. It does not refer to those who do not fight, but those who actively bring conflict to an end. Not surprisingly, there is some risk in that. So I particularly acknowledge the service of Carol and Jennifer and the many other peacekeepers in accepting that risk in the noble pursuit of peace. That concludes this webinar, and thank you for your attendance.